What would you do if the people closest to you mocked your deepest pain? The question seemed to hang in the air as I sat at the dinner table, barely tasting the gourmet meal in front of me. The soft hum of conversation swirled around me, but it all felt distant, like I was trapped in a fog. It wasn't the food or the elegant decor that caught my attention, it was the words that followed. I was used to the usual digs from Jake's family. They were rich, successful, and impeccably dressed. Everything they had seemed to come easily: money, opportunities, connections. I, on the other hand, had worked for every single thing I'd achieved. I wasn't born into privilege. I didn't have a silver spoon in my mouth. And most notably, I didn't have my mom. My mother had passed away when I was just 17. Cancer had taken her quickly, leaving me with a hole in my chest that never quite healed. It had been hard to deal with her death, but over the years, I learned to keep her memory alive, especially during moments that felt too big for me to handle on my own. I had hoped that Jake, my fiancé, the love of my life, would understand. He knew how deeply I missed my mom, how I carried her with me in everything I did. When we first got engaged, I even mentioned that I wanted my wedding to honor her in some way, nothing extravagant, but a small tribute, something simple, like wearing a locket with her picture inside. Jake had been supportive. Of course, he'd said, it's important to remember the people we love. But tonight, I was beginning to wonder if that was ever truly the case. I had agreed to join Jake and his family for dinner at his parents' mansion, something I usually tried to avoid. Their idea of a casual evening was nothing short of extravagant, and I often felt out of place. I hated the way they looked at me, like I was a curiosity they couldn't quite figure out. But Jake was insistent. It'll be fun, Em. Come on, just one night, he'd said. So here I was, sitting at a beautifully set table, with everyone dressed to the nines, and I didn't quite fit in. My simple dress paled in comparison to the designer gowns his sister and aunt wore. My hair, done hastily in a simple bun, seemed out of place next to his mother's perfectly styled locks. And yet, I had never felt more disconnected from everything around me. Jake's aunt, a woman with sharp features and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, leaned in from across the table. So, Emma, she began, her voice dripping with feigned interest, how are your parents doing? I knew she was referring to my late mother. She always asked this in an almost mocking way, as if she couldn't quite understand the gravity of the question. But tonight, I wasn't going to let it slide. I had learned to bite my tongue in the past, but this time, something in me snapped. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say anything, she continued. I guess your mom would have loved to see you in all of this, huh? She gestured around the room, the gold chandeliers, the white marble floors, the crystal glasses of wine. Too bad she couldn't stick around to see you with all this money and status. My heart stopped. I glanced at Jake, desperate for some kind of support, but his face remained calm, too calm. He didn't even look at me, as if he hadn't heard the words that cut straight to the bone. My mother, the woman who had taught me how to be kind, how to work hard, how to cherish every small moment. And here they were, laughing, mocking her memory as though she was some joke. I felt my hands tremble slightly, but I clenched them under the table, trying to keep myself together. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe. I was sitting there, in the midst of this grand dinner, and I felt smaller than ever before. Jake, I said, my voice shaky, did you hear what she just said? Jake finally looked at me, but his expression was distant. He didn't seem angry. He didn't seem surprised. He just looked at me. Emma, he said softly, almost too softly, don't let it get to you. They don't mean anything by it. You know how they are. My stomach churned. No, Jake, this isn't just some careless remark. She mocked my mother, my dead mother, in front of everyone. And you just let it happen. Jake opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His mother, seated beside him, raised an eyebrow at me. Emma, sweetheart, you have to understand. That's just Aunt Clarice. She's not good with sensitive topics. Sensitive topics? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. You think it's sensitive to mock the memory of someone who's gone? The room seemed to quiet down. Everyone shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes darting between me and Jake. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I'm sorry, Emma, Jake finally said, but it didn't sound like he truly meant it. It was as if he was apologizing just to make it stop. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw my glass of wine at the wall. I wanted to yell at Jake, tell him that I couldn't keep pretending anymore, that this wasn't what I had signed up for, this wasn't the man I thought I knew. But all I could do was sit there, staring at the plate in front of me and wonder when I had become invisible. When had my feelings stopped mattering to him? When had my mother's memory become something they could laugh at, joke about, and degrade? The tears that had been threatening to spill over now welled up in my eyes, but I held them back, refusing to let them fall. I think I need some air, I whispered, standing up abruptly. Jake didn't follow me. Of course he didn't. He stayed there, his eyes fixed on his plate, as if the weight of this conversation wasn't enough to move him. I walked out of the dining room, out into the garden, and leaned against the cold stone wall, breathing deeply, trying to steady my racing heart. What was I doing here? Why was I still with someone who couldn't stand up for me? I had loved Jake. I still loved him in a way. But at that moment, I felt so alone. Alone in a room full of people, alone with my grief, and alone with the realization that the person I thought I would spend my life with might not be the person I thought he was. And I couldn't help but wonder, what would I do if I had to face this every day for the rest of my life? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? It wasn't always like this. There was a time when I was carefree, when my world didn't revolve around trying to impress people who didn't care about me. I had dreams, real dreams. But those dreams were shattered the moment my mom was diagnosed with cancer. I was 17 when it all happened. I had just finished my junior year of high school, and everything seemed like it was falling into place. I was a good student, a competitive swimmer, and I had a close-knit group of friends. Most of all, I had my mom. She was the center of my world, my biggest cheerleader, my confidant, and my rock. We were a small family. My dad had left when I was little, and Mom had raised me on her own. She worked as a nurse, always giving everything she had to her patients, often working long shifts. I remember how she would come home exhausted, but would still make time to help me with my homework, listen to my stories, and reassure me when I felt down. She was everything to me. Then came the diagnosis. I remember the moment I overheard my mom on the phone with the doctor, her voice shaking, barely holding it together. The silence that followed, when she finally hung up, seemed to stretch forever. She sat me down that night, and through tears, she told me the news. She had cancer, a rare form that was already in the later stages. For the first time in my life, I felt completely lost. It was hard to see the woman who had always been so strong, so capable, so full of life, suddenly become frail. Mom tried to stay positive, but it was clear that the battle was wearing her down. The worst part was watching her try to shield me from the truth. She didn't want me to know just how bad it was, but I could see it in her eyes. She fought for a year, fought harder than anyone I knew, but in the end, cancer won. She died in the spring of my senior year, just a few weeks before my graduation. Her funeral felt like the world had caved in on me. It was as if I was standing outside of myself, looking at the wreckage of my life, and I couldn't understand how I was supposed to go on without her. I didn't know how to be me without her. For the longest time, I wandered through life in a haze, unsure of who I was or what I was supposed to do next. The grief was unbearable, and I could never talk about it with my friends. No one really understood the depth of my pain. They'd say things like, "It'll get better with time." But how could it? How could anything get better when the person who meant everything to you is gone? It was during this time that I met Jake. Jake was a bright spot in my darkness, or at least, I thought he was. I met him during my first year of college, when I was still in the thick of mourning my mother's death. He was a handsome guy, athletic, funny, charming. We met at a party, of all places, and though I wasn't in the mood for socializing, he made me laugh. We talked about silly things, about movies and our favorite bands, and before I knew it, I was smiling again. Jake wasn't like the others. He actually listened to me. He didn't shy away from talking about my mom or my grief. At first, it was comforting to have someone who could understand, someone who accepted my scars. Over time, he became a huge part of my life. He was my escape. And for a while, that was enough. We dated for 3 years, and during that time, I watched as Jake's world seemed to open up before him. He came from an affluent family, and they were more than happy to see him succeed. His mother, Carol, was a typical wealthy woman, gracious but distant, always maintaining the perfect appearance. His father, a self-made businessman, was no different. His siblings were just as polished, always impeccably dressed and perfectly poised. I wasn't anything like them, and that's when the unease began. At first, I thought it was just my insecurities playing tricks on me. I would sit at their family dinners, watching as everyone spoke about their vacations, their latest investments, their accomplishments, and I felt like an outsider. My mother's memory was my only connection to the life I had left behind, but I couldn't talk about her around them. It felt like a wall went up every time I mentioned her, like they didn't know how to respond. But Jake was always there for me. He assured me that his family wasn't trying to be insensitive. "They just don't get it," he would say. "They're used to a different world." I told myself that he was right. After all, I had never been part of his world. He had every right to be proud of where he came from, right? But slowly, the cracks started to show. The comments became more frequent, and the looks became more pronounced. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about my past, my grief, and my mother. I began to feel like I was being judged, not directly, but subtly. There were comments about my childhood, my humble beginnings, and how different I was from the family. At first, I brushed it off. But over time, it started to eat away at me. And as the wedding plans began to take shape, so did the pressure. Jake proposed to me after 4 years of dating, and I was thrilled. I wanted to marry him, I truly did. But as we started planning, something began to shift in me. The more I spent time with his family, the more uncomfortable I became. I wanted my wedding to feel like a celebration of love and respect, both for Jake and for my mother. But as the months went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jake's family would never understand. They didn't see how important my mother's memory was to me. And every time I tried to bring it up, whether it was about the locket or a small mention of her, they'd look at me like I was being unreasonable. I started to question whether I was the one who was being too sensitive. After all, Jake had always told me they didn't mean anything by it. Maybe I was overthinking things. But the truth was, I wasn't sure anymore. I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending that everything was fine. And then, that dinner happened. The one where Aunt Clarice's cruel words ripped open old wounds. Everything changed that night. The days after that dinner were a blur. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Aunt Clarice's face. Her cold, calculating smile as she casually mocked my mother's death. It was like the words were burned into my memory, and no matter how hard I tried to shake them off, they clung to me like a dark shadow. Jake didn't seem to get it. Or maybe he did, but he didn't want to confront the reality of the situation. He kept trying to smooth things over, saying that Aunt Clarice had been just joking, that she didn't mean it. But I wasn't a fool. I knew what I heard. And more importantly, I knew how it made me feel. It felt like a slap in the face, and the worst part was that Jake wasn't standing up for me. He wasn't standing up for us. I kept telling myself that I should just move past it, that it was a small thing in the grand scheme of our relationship. After all, there would be plenty of other dinners, plenty of other opportunities to show his family who I was and how much my mother had meant to me. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized that I couldn't just let it go. The more I tried to forget, the more I realized that this was about something much bigger than one thoughtless comment. This was about how Jake's family saw me, how they saw my past, and how Jake, the man I was about to marry, seemed unwilling to truly understand it. It became painfully clear that something fundamental had shifted between us. The tension was palpable every time I saw him. He had stopped asking how I was doing or if I was okay. Instead, he seemed more focused on the wedding plans, the big day that was fast approaching. And me? I felt like I was being left behind. The conflict between us built slowly but steadily. I started to notice the small things, the way he would brush off my concerns when I tried to talk about the wedding. The way he would sidestep my attempts to discuss how my mother's memory could be honored in the ceremony. The comments from his family didn't help either. They were subtle at first, little jabs about how I wasn't fancy enough or how I needed to step up my game to fit into their world, but they kept coming. There was one moment that stuck with me. Jake and I were sitting in the living room, talking about the guest list. I was explaining how important it was for me to invite a few of my mom's closest friends, people who had supported her through her illness. People who had been there for me when I felt like I had no one. Jake frowned. I don't get why it has to be such a big deal. It's just a few people, right? Can't we just invite the usual crowd? His words stung more than I expected. The usual crowd. That's what he thought my mother's friends were? I could feel my anger rising, but I tried to stay calm. These people were my mom's friends, Jake. They helped her through everything. They are a big deal. I want them there. Jake looked at me, his expression distant, almost like he was tired of hearing me talk about my mom. I just think it's weird, he muttered. Why can't we just focus on our day? Why do you have to make it about your mom every time? And there it was, the hurtful words I had been dreading. The dismissal. The feeling of being so completely alone in this relationship. My heart raced, and for a split second, I wondered if I had made a huge mistake by even thinking about marrying him. Jake, I whispered, trying to steady my voice, I'm not asking for the whole wedding to be about my mom. I just want a small tribute, something that acknowledges the person who made me who I am. Is that so hard to understand? He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just stood up, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, Emma. I'm just trying to make this easy. It's supposed to be a happy day for both of us. But was it really going to be? Was it possible for both of us to be happy if we were so clearly at odds? If I couldn't even have a small piece of my past honored on the most important day of my life, what did that say about our future? I sat in stunned silence as Jake left the room, his words hanging in the air like an unfinished sentence. I wanted to scream, to tell him how much his dismissiveness hurt, but I didn't. Because deep down, I feared that if I did, he would walk away. And I wasn't ready for that. But more and more, I started to feel like I was walking a tightrope. Every conversation felt like an argument waiting to happen. Every decision felt like a test of loyalty. It was as though I was losing the man I had fallen in love with, and the more I tried to hold on, the further he seemed to slip away. At the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just Jake's family and their dismissive attitude towards my past. It was the fact that I was beginning to question whether I was truly seen in this relationship, whether my needs, my feelings, were being respected. I had always prided myself on being independent, on standing strong even when the world felt like it was falling apart. But now, with the wedding looming, I wasn't sure if I could continue pretending that everything was okay. The conflict was building to a breaking point. And I knew, deep down, that something had to give. I wasn't sure what that would look like, but I knew I couldn't keep ignoring the signs. I couldn't keep pretending that the man I loved was still the same person I had fallen for. And so, as the days ticked by, I began to ask myself the question that had been quietly haunting me for weeks. Could I really marry a man who didn't understand or respect the most important part of my life? The answer wasn't as simple as I hoped it would be. But one thing was certain. Whatever came next, it was going to change everything. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur of last-minute decisions, frantic planning, and mounting tension. The reality of what was happening hit me harder each day. I could no longer ignore the cracks that were growing between Jake and me. It was as if I was standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure of whether to take the leap or turn back. But turning back felt impossible. I had invested so much into this relationship, into this dream of marrying Jake, that I couldn't bring myself to admit that something had gone horribly wrong. But I was starting to realize that pretending everything was okay wasn't going to work anymore. I had tried to talk to Jake about my concerns, tried to tell him how much his family's behavior, his lack of support, had been affecting me, but each conversation felt like it was getting harder to have. He would listen, nodding along, but there was always a defensiveness in his tone, a subtle tension that told me he wasn't truly hearing me. His answers were vague, always redirecting to the wedding and how we needed to stay focused on the big day. The more I tried to voice my feelings, the more I felt like a nuisance, a distraction. And then there was the night I'd been dreading. It was a Thursday, just days before the wedding. I had finished the last of the wedding preparations, and I was sitting in my apartment alone, my thoughts racing. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. I had been thinking about the conversation we had had about my mother's memory and how I felt so unseen in this relationship. I couldn't shake the feeling that Jake had become a stranger to me. The man who had once been my rock, the man who had promised to love and cherish me, was now someone who barely acknowledged my pain. Every interaction felt more like a transaction than an expression of love. I felt small. I felt invisible. That's when the phone rang. It was Jake. His voice on the other end of the line sounded unusually stiff, distant. "Hey, Emma. We need to talk." My stomach sank. I knew instantly that this conversation wasn't going to go the way I hoped. "Okay, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep the panic from seeping into my voice. "I think we need to reassess some things," Jake said. "I've been talking to my family, and I've realized that we're not really on the same page about this wedding. It's becoming clear that you're not really fitting in with the family. And maybe it's best if we take a step back." My world tilted on its axis. "What?" "Jake, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe we rushed into this," he replied, his voice cold and clinical. "Maybe you're not the right person for me. Maybe we're not ready for this. You've got your thing with your mom, and I've got mine with my family. It's becoming too much." I couldn't breathe. Every word he said felt like a punch to the gut. I had been expecting tension, but not like this. Not this level of disconnection. This coldness. "You're breaking up with me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can marry you, Emma. Not if it means sacrificing my family and my future." There was no apology in his voice, no remorse, just a cold finality. Maybe this is for the best. My head was spinning. I wanted to scream, to fight, to demand that he take it back. But I knew deep down that this wasn't just a rash decision. This was the culmination of everything that had been building between us, the divide, the misunderstandings, the lack of respect. This wasn't just about my mom's memory. It was about who I was, who he wanted me to be, and whether we could ever truly align. It was a devastating realization. In that moment, everything I had been holding onto, my hope, my future, the life I had dreamed of with him, came crashing down. "You can't just give up on us like this," I managed to choke out. "We were supposed to get married. We were supposed to be a team." "We were never on the same team, Emma," Jake replied, his voice devoid of warmth. "And I don't think we ever will be." I didn't know how to respond. The tears were already welling up in my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. I couldn't. I had to be strong. But as I hung up the phone, I knew something deep inside me had shattered. I couldn't marry him. Not now. Not like this. But it wasn't just about Jake. It was about the way I had let myself lose sight of who I was. The way I had allowed someone else's family to dictate my worth. The way I had allowed myself to be convinced that I wasn't good enough, that my love for my mother, my history, my grief, was something I had to apologize for. I had been so blinded by love and hope that I had ignored the warning signs. I had let myself believe that things would get better, that Jake would eventually understand. But I was wrong. And now, standing on the edge of everything I thought I wanted, I realized that I had to take control of my life again. I couldn't keep waiting for someone else to validate my feelings. I couldn't keep bending and compromising, trying to fit into a life that wasn't mine. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I was done with pretending. It was time for me to reclaim my future, and if that meant walking away from everything I had thought I wanted, then so be it. I had to cancel the wedding. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, but it was also the most freeing. I wasn't just canceling a wedding. I was canceling the version of myself that had allowed someone else's expectations to define me. I was canceling the lie that I wasn't enough. And I was finally ready to embrace the woman I was meant to be. The woman who deserved better. The woman who didn't need permission to honor her past. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The day I canceled the wedding felt surreal. My hands shook as I typed out the message to the wedding planner, canceling everything. The dress, the venue, the catering, gone in an instant. I couldn't stop staring at the screen, as if the words I had typed would somehow turn back time, or as if deleting them would erase the decision I'd just made. But deep down, I knew it was the right choice. I had no idea what to do next. The feeling of loss overwhelmed me, yet beneath it was a strange sense of liberation. The wedding I had dreamed of, the future I had imagined with Jake, no longer existed. The person I thought I knew had become a stranger to me, and in many ways, I had become a stranger to myself. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. Was I supposed to feel relief? Grief? Regret? Maybe all of those things at once. All I knew was that I was walking away from a life I had envisioned, a life that no longer fit who I had become. That night, I sat in my apartment in the dim light, staring at the empty space where wedding magazines, fabric swatches, and the guest list had once been. It was almost ironic, the contrast between the life I had once imagined and the stark, quiet reality of the present. I picked up my phone and stared at it for a moment, wondering if I should text Jake. Should I explain myself? Should I try to salvage what little was left of us? But I already knew the answer. There was nothing left to explain. He had made his choice, and I had made mine. The phone rang. I glanced at the screen. It was Jake. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the phone ring, my thumb hovering over the screen. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, the thudding in my chest growing louder as the seconds stretched on. Should I talk to him? Could I even talk to him? Would it make a difference? Finally, I pressed decline and set the phone down. I couldn't do it. Not tonight. But the moment I made that decision, something inside me broke. It wasn't the breaking I had expected. There were no loud crashes, no dramatic moments of screaming or tears. It was quieter, deeper. It felt as if I had finally allowed myself to let go. I didn't need him to validate me anymore. I didn't need anyone to tell me I was worthy of love and respect. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to sit with my emotions. I didn't fight them. I didn't try to suppress them. I just let them wash over me, grief, anger, confusion, relief. And then, beneath it all, I felt something else, strength. The strength that had been buried under layers of doubt, under years of trying to please others, of trying to fit into a life that wasn't mine. The strength to stand on my own, to trust myself. It wasn't going to be easy. I knew that. But I also knew that this was the first step towards healing. The next morning, I woke up early. The sunlight streamed through the window, casting a golden glow over the room. It was a new day, and I felt a new sense of clarity. I didn't have to rush this process. I didn't have to have everything figured out. What mattered was that I had made the right decision for myself, even if it was the hardest decision I'd ever had to make. I grabbed my phone and opened up my messages. I had dozens of texts from Jake, all pleading for answers. But it was the message from my best friend, Megan, that caught my eye. Emma, I'm here for you. Whatever you need, I've got you. But I'm also so proud of you. You've got this. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're less than amazing. I smiled at her message, feeling a lump rise in my throat. Megan had been by my side through everything, the death of my mother, my highs and my lows, and now, through the most painful chapter of my life. She had always known me better than anyone, and her words meant more than she would ever know. I typed a quick reply, "Thank you. I'm not sure what's next, but I know I'm going to be okay." And I meant it. Deep down, I knew that whatever came next, I was strong enough to handle it. I wasn't the girl who had stayed in a relationship for the sake of keeping up appearances. I wasn't the girl who had sacrificed herself to please others. I had broken free, and there was no turning back now. As the day went on, I found myself making small decisions, picking up the pieces of my life and choosing what was truly important. I spent hours on the phone with Megan, laughing and crying as we reminisced about our college days, about the moments that had shaped me into the person I was today. I didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't scared of what was ahead. By the time evening came, I felt like a different person. I wasn't defined by my past with Jake, or by his family's judgment. I was defined by my own choices, by my own strength. I was finally, truly, free. And yet, despite all the freedom, a part of me still mourned the loss of what could have been. I wasn't naive enough to think that I wouldn't have moments of doubt, moments where I wondered if I had made the right choice. But I knew I had to trust myself. I had to trust that walking away from a relationship that didn't honor me was the only path to true peace. As the sun set and the sky darkened, I sat quietly on my balcony, staring out at the city. It was a bittersweet feeling, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I was learning how to stand alone, and in that stillness, I found a kind of peace I hadn't known I was capable of. Tomorrow, I would face whatever came next. But for tonight, I allowed myself to simply be, without the weight of expectations, without the suffocating pressure of trying to make someone else happy. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges. But for tonight, I was enough. Just as I was. The days after I canceled the wedding felt like they belonged to a different life. At first, I found myself constantly second-guessing my decision. Was I being too impulsive? Was I overreacting? Maybe if I had tried harder to make things work with Jake, things could have been different. But as each day passed, those doubts became quieter, drowned out by something more powerful, peace. I found solace in the small moments of stillness. The gentle hum of the world moving on around me, the soft click of keys as I typed out emails for work, the comforting smell of coffee as I brewed my morning cup. Life was continuing, despite the storm inside my chest that had raged only days before. I realized, too, that my journey wasn't just about leaving Jake behind. It was about rediscovering myself. The woman who had almost forgotten what it felt like to be at peace with her own choices, the woman who had spent so many years molding herself to fit someone else's life, to please others at the cost of her own happiness. It was about learning how to breathe again without feeling like I was choking on expectations. Megan was my rock through all of this. We spent hours talking, not just about Jake, but about my life, my goals, and my dreams. It felt so good to talk to someone who knew me so well, someone who loved me not because of the person I had been with, but because of who I was, independently. She reminded me of the things I had put on the back burner, my love for photography, my desire to travel the world, the things that made my heart race with excitement and possibility. One afternoon, a few weeks after the wedding that never was, I took a walk through the park near my apartment. The autumn leaves crunched beneath my feet as I wandered aimlessly, letting the cool air fill my lungs. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel like I was walking through a fog. I felt clear. I sat on a bench and pulled out my phone, scrolling through my photos. I hadn't taken many pictures since my mom passed away, but there were a few old shots of my childhood, of moments when I felt truly happy. I paused on a photo of my mom and me from one of our trips to the beach, both of us smiling wide. It was hard not to cry when I saw her face, but there was a warmth there too. A sense of remembering, of knowing that even though she was gone, the love she had given me would always be a part of who I was. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, and for the first time in months, I let myself smile. My mom would have wanted me to live a life that was mine, not one that was defined by the opinions of others, not one that was built on pretending to be someone I wasn't. I realized then that canceling the wedding wasn't just about Jake. It was about honoring myself and everything I had been through to get to this point. I wasn't broken. I was healing. As I stood up to leave the park, a familiar voice called my name. Emma? I turned around to see Jenna, one of my old college roommates, walking toward me. We hadn't spoken in a while, but there was something in her eyes that made me feel like I wasn't alone. She had always been a no-nonsense kind of person, someone who told it like it was, but in the best way. "Hey, Jenna," I said, walking toward her. "Long time no see." She pulled me into a hug, and for a moment, I just let myself lean into it, grateful for the comfort of a friend who had been there for me even when I hadn't known how to ask for it. "I've been hearing things," Jenna said, raising an eyebrow. "I won't lie. I heard about the wedding. And about Jake. You okay?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'm okay. I think I made the right decision." "I knew you would," Jenna said with a knowing smile. "You've always been stronger than you give yourself credit for." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I had spent so much of my life doubting myself, wondering if I was enough, if I was doing enough. But standing there in that moment, in the sunlight with Jenna, I realized that I was enough. I always had been. I had just needed to learn to trust myself. "Do you mind if I sit with you for a bit?" Jenna asked. "Of course." I was just about to head home. We walked to a nearby cafe and sat down at a small table, sipping on our drinks as we talked about everything and nothing. It was such a relief to have someone who didn't ask questions about why I had walked away, someone who just understood. "Have you thought about what you're going to do next?" Jenna asked, her eyes studying me as she took a sip of her coffee. I paused, unsure of how to answer. I hadn't really thought about the future in a concrete way, not since everything with Jake fell apart. But as I sat there with her, I realized that the future didn't have to be something to fear. It was just life, waiting to unfold. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think I'm finally ready to figure it out." "Good," she said, smiling. "Because I think you've got a whole world of possibilities waiting for you. You just need to go after it." I nodded, feeling a surge of excitement inside me. It was as if something had shifted, like a door had finally opened. I wasn't sure where that door would lead, but I was ready to walk through it. As I left the cafe later that afternoon, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. I was going to move forward, step by step, even if I didn't have all the answers. I had made it through the hardest part, and now I could choose what came next. I wasn't just moving on. I was moving forward. For the first time in ages, I felt in control of my life. And for the first time, I felt truly free. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city, I whispered to myself, "It's okay to let go. And it's okay to start over." And in that moment, I knew that no matter what came next, I was ready. The weeks that followed felt like an awakening. Each day, I began to put the pieces of my life back together, slowly, methodically, and with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. There was still sadness, yes, but it was no longer the kind that consumed me. It was more of a quiet ache, a reminder of the past, but not one that held me hostage. I was learning to live without Jake, without the future I thought I'd have. I had always been the type of person to move in a straight line, to follow the path that was laid out in front of me. But now it felt like I was walking in a whole new direction, and I didn't have to know exactly where I was going. I just had to keep walking. One of the first things I did was take up photography again. It was something I had put on the back burner for years, but I realized I had missed it more than I'd cared to admit. My mom had always been so supportive of my creative side, encouraging me to follow my passion, no matter what. It was almost as if her spirit had been whispering to me, urging me to reclaim that part of myself. I signed up for a weekend photography class at a local community center, and it felt like a small victory just to be doing something that was solely for me. The first few sessions were awkward. I hadn't picked up a camera in so long, and I felt rusty, but with each click of the shutter, it all started to come back. The way light fell on a subject, the way colors popped in the frame, it was like breathing again. The class became a new sanctuary for me, a place where I could focus on something other than the mess of my personal life. The people I met there were welcoming, and I started to make new friends, people who didn't know me as Jake's fiancé or the woman who had once lived a life designed around someone else. They knew me as Emma, the woman who had a passion for capturing the beauty in the world, even when her own life felt like it was falling apart. But it wasn't just photography that helped me heal, it was the act of allowing myself to be vulnerable again, to connect with others in a way I hadn't allowed myself to do for years. I realized how much of my identity had been tied to Jake, to our relationship, and how little of it had been tied to who I truly was. I spent more time with Megan, who was a constant source of support and encouragement. We had long conversations over wine and late-night ice cream, talking about everything from childhood memories to our biggest dreams. She reminded me of my worth in ways I had forgotten. And through it all, she never once asked me if I regretted calling off the wedding. She just knew. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Megan turned to me and said, "You know, I don't think I've ever seen you this happy. Even when you were with Jake, you weren't this present." I looked at her, surprised by the observation. "You really think so?" She nodded. "Yeah, you're not just going through the motions anymore. You're living. And that's the best thing you can do for yourself right now." I smiled at her, feeling a warmth in my chest that had been absent for so long. It was true. I was living again. It wasn't always easy, and there were still days when I missed the comfort of Jake's presence, even if that comfort had been built on a false foundation. But I wasn't letting myself get lost in that anymore. It was in those quiet moments, when I wasn't thinking about the future, when I wasn't caught in the drama of my past, that I felt the most at peace. I had learned to find joy in the present. I had learned that happiness wasn't something I had to chase or find in someone else. It was something I could create within myself. But I still hadn't figured out everything. The question of what came next, what my life would look like now, still loomed over me. One evening, after another late-night conversation with Megan, I found myself lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. I realized that there was no perfect plan, no guidebook for healing or moving on. I could spend the rest of my life analyzing what went wrong with Jake, wondering if I could have done something differently, but the truth was, I had done the best I could with the information I had at the time. And now I was choosing to move forward. It was time to let go of the past once and for all. I made a decision that night. I would go to the beach. My mom had always loved the ocean, and it had been a place of peace for me growing up. The idea of leaving the city, of just being alone with my thoughts by the water, felt like the reset I needed. The next weekend, I packed a bag and drove out to the coast. The air was salty and fresh, and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore filled me with a sense of calm. I spent hours walking along the sand, letting the waves lap at my feet, taking pictures of the horizon, of the way the light danced on the water. For the first time in months, I felt at ease. The ocean, in its vastness and beauty, reminded me that there was so much more to life than what I had been focusing on. It was a reminder that life, like the tide, moves forward, no matter how difficult the currents may be. I stayed for the weekend, but it wasn't just a getaway. It was a turning point. I had allowed myself to truly grieve, to let go of the things I couldn't change and embrace the things I could. And as I drove back to the city on Sunday night, I felt something inside me shift. I wasn't waiting for someone else to define my happiness anymore. I was taking it back. The journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. I had no idea what the future would hold, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to find out. I was ready to embrace it, whatever it may be. The hardest chapter of my life had passed, but the rest of my story was still being written. And this time, I would be the one holding the pen. After returning from the beach, something had shifted inside me. The coastal air, the sound of the waves, the vastness of the ocean, it all reminded me that life is too short to waste on regrets. I could no longer let myself be trapped in the past or in the confines of what I thought I was supposed to do. I needed to step into the unknown, to embrace whatever came next, even if it scared me. I had made peace with the fact that Jake and I were no longer part of each other's futures, but there was still a sense of uncertainty that lingered. What did my future look like? What did I really want out of life now that I wasn't planning it around someone else? The question weighed on me as I returned to work. My days were busy, my inbox constantly filled with emails, but I found myself daydreaming in the quiet moments. There was a pull within me, an urge to explore, to discover something bigger than the small, predictable life I had been leading. It felt like a calling I couldn't ignore anymore. One afternoon, after another routine work meeting, I walked to the cafe around the corner. I had been spending a lot of time there recently, just sitting with my thoughts, sketching in my notebook, or working on a new photography project. It was peaceful, the hum of conversation in the background like the soundtrack to my new life. As I sat with my coffee, scrolling through some travel blogs, I stumbled upon a post about a volunteer photography project in South America. They were looking for photographers to join a team that would document life in remote villages, helping to tell the stories of communities in need. The idea gripped me instantly. It was everything I loved: photography, storytelling, travel, but more than that, it felt like a purpose, a mission I could give my heart to. I immediately felt a sense of excitement in my chest, followed by a rush of fear. Could I really do this? Was I ready to step out of my comfort zone like this? I had just left a toxic relationship and was still finding my feet, and now I was considering volunteering on the other side of the world. But something inside me knew I had to at least try. I spent the next few hours researching the project, reading testimonials from past volunteers, looking at pictures of the breathtaking landscapes. The more I learned, the more the idea took hold of me. It wasn't just about escaping my life in the city, it was about diving into something meaningful. I wasn't just looking for an adventure, I was looking for a way to reconnect with the world, to contribute, to experience life from a completely different perspective. That evening, I talked to Megan about it. She had been my sounding board through all of this, and I knew she would give me honest advice. "You want to go to South America and volunteer as a photographer?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Are you sure about this?" I nodded, the excitement in my voice betraying any hesitation I might have been feeling. "It feels right, Meg. I've been feeling this pull for a while. I think I need to do this. I need to step out of my bubble." Megan didn't hesitate. She smiled and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Emma, I think you should go. You're not the same person you were when I met you. You've been through so much, but I can see how much you've changed. You're ready for this." Her words meant everything to me. She had always believed in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself. With her encouragement, I made up my mind. I was going to apply. The application process took a few weeks, and I went through rounds of interviews, but finally, I received the email. I was accepted. It was real. I had been selected to join the team of photographers, traveling to South America for 6 months, documenting the lives of the people in remote communities. The realization hit me like a wave, both terrifying and exhilarating. The first few days after receiving the news were a blur. I had to sort through a mountain of paperwork, get vaccinations, and prepare for the journey ahead. The more I immersed myself in the logistics, the more I realized just how big of a change this was going to be. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: hope. This was a fresh start. It wasn't just an escape, It was an opportunity to learn, to grow, to give back, and to discover what really mattered to me. I was taking control of my life, no longer letting circumstances or fear dictate my choices. But there were still moments of doubt. In the quiet hours, when the weight of the unknown settled over me, I questioned everything. Was I ready to leave everything behind: my friends, my job, my life in the city? What would happen when I returned? Would I ever be the same person again? One evening, Megan and I sat together in my apartment, sipping wine, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light over the room. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "What if I'm making a huge mistake?" Megan leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady but kind. "Emma, you've been through hell and back, and you've come out stronger than you think. This is just the beginning. If you don't do this, you'll always wonder. You have to take the leap." Her words hit me hard. She was right. I had been holding myself back for so long, afraid of making the wrong choice, of failing, of being hurt. But the truth was, not trying at all would be the real failure. I had to take the risk. I had to believe in myself. A week before my departure, I said goodbye to the city I had called home for so long. The apartment I had shared with Jake was packed up and put into storage, a symbol of the life I was leaving behind. I wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in ages, I felt free. The airport was chaotic, filled with the noise of announcements and the hustle of travelers rushing to their gates. But amidst the chaos, I felt strangely calm. This wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning. I boarded the plane with a sense of anticipation in my chest. This wasn't just a journey to a new place, it was a journey to a new version of myself. And I was ready to embrace whatever came next. The long flight to South America gave me plenty of time to reflect. My heart raced with anticipation, but beneath the excitement, there was also a quiet fear that I hadn't fully confronted yet. What if I wasn't strong enough for this? What if I found myself overwhelmed, wanting to run back to my old life? As the plane ascended into the clouds, I watched the city below shrink into nothingness. The life I had known for so long, the life with Jake, the wedding, the dream was behind me now. I was finally doing something for myself, something I had chosen, something that wasn't dictated by anyone else's expectations. The first few days in South America felt like a whirlwind. After landing in the bustling city of Lima, I was whisked away by a local team who took care of the logistics, transport, accommodation, and introductions. We were traveling to remote villages where technology was scarce and life moved at a different pace than I was accustomed to. I couldn't help but feel out of place at first, my thoughts clouded with doubts. Could I connect with these people? What could I possibly offer them in return for their stories? The first village we visited was nestled in the Andes Mountains, a place where the air was thin and the landscape stretched out in every direction like a painting. I was assigned to document the daily lives of the locals, their traditions, their struggles, their victories. The camera felt foreign in my hands at first, but slowly, I began to see the world through the lens. One particular afternoon, I met an elderly woman named Rosa. She was sitting outside her modest home, weaving baskets from palm leaves. Her hands were weathered, and her skin was lined with the marks of a life lived in the harsh conditions of the mountains. She smiled at me as I approached, her eyes bright despite the weariness in her body. "You're the photographer?" she asked in Spanish, her voice soft but steady. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. My Spanish was rusty at best, but she seemed patient. As I began to take pictures of her weaving, she shared stories about her life, how she had lived through times of hardship, how her family had persevered, and how the traditions of her ancestors had been passed down through generations. "I'm just one person," she said, "but my story is part of a bigger one. We are all connected, you see? We do what we can, for ourselves and for others." Her words struck a chord deep within me. I had spent so long focusing on my own pain and heartbreak, I had forgotten how much more there was to life. Rosa's life was one of resilience, not because she was without hardship, but because she understood the importance of community and tradition. She taught me something valuable in those moments. Life wasn't about escaping pain. It was about finding meaning in it and sharing that meaning with others. I spent the next few days immersing myself in the village's daily routines. The people here didn't just survive, they lived with purpose. Each day felt like a celebration of the simplest joys, a harvest, a shared meal, a moment of laughter between families. There were challenges, of course, but there was something profoundly grounding about the way they approached life. I could feel myself becoming part of the community, not just an observer, but someone who was learning and absorbing everything around her. Every time I lifted my camera, I felt more connected to the people in front of me. Each photograph was a story. Each shot captured not just their image, but their spirit. I started to realize that this project wasn't just about documenting others, it was about documenting my own healing. I was learning to see beauty in things I had once overlooked, the kindness of strangers, the resilience of communities, and the strength that came from letting go of the past. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, I sat with some of the women from the village around a fire. We shared stories, and though we didn't speak the same language, there was an unspoken bond between us. They had known hardship, just as I had. But they had also known hope, and that was what I needed to learn. I found myself laughing, truly laughing, for the first time in months. I realized that, despite the challenges I faced, I was surrounded by people who had found their own way to heal. They had suffered, but they had also thrived. And that realization gave me the strength I didn't know I was missing. The next few weeks were a blur of new experiences, traveling from one village to another, immersing myself in the local culture, and continuing to take photos that told the stories of the people I met. Each village had its own unique beauty, its own rhythm of life. And with each new place, I began to feel like I was discovering something new about myself, too. But as much as I was learning, I still had moments of doubt. What if I couldn't make a real difference? What if the stories I was telling weren't enough? I questioned my role in all of this. But then I remembered Rosa's words. We are all connected. Perhaps I didn't need to change the world, I just needed to share its stories. And in doing so, I was already contributing to something bigger than myself. One evening, after returning from a particularly difficult day of photographing the aftermath of a storm in a neighboring village, I sat alone in my small room, reflecting. The images from that day were heavy, images of destruction, of loss, but also of people helping each other rebuild. I had witnessed the raw reality of life in these villages, and it wasn't always pretty. But it was real. And sometimes, the most powerful stories came from the toughest moments. That night, I wrote in my journal, what if I had never left? What if I had stayed in my old life, where everything was safe and predictable? I would have never known this, never known the depth of humanity, the strength that exists in the face of adversity. I would have missed the healing that comes from community, from sharing stories and bearing witness. I would have missed everything. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. This journey wasn't just about finding myself, it was about finding my purpose. I had left behind a life of uncertainty, but in doing so, I had found something more solid than I could have ever imagined. The future was still uncertain, but it no longer filled me with fear. It filled me with possibility. And for the first time in a long while, I was no longer running away from the past. I was running toward the future. As the weeks passed, my time in South America became more than just a project. It became a transformative experience. The more I immersed myself in the cultures and communities, the more I realized how much of my old self was being left behind. The Emma who had been clinging to the remnants of a life she had outgrown was slowly fading. In her place was someone new, someone braver, more grounded, and determined to face challenges head-on. But change, I had learned, doesn't come easily. It often comes with moments of doubt, moments when the weight of the world feels like it's pressing down on you. My time in the remote villages had not been without its difficulties. The long hours, the constant emotional pull, The exhaustion of living in such isolation, it all started to catch up with me. One afternoon, we were traveling to a village located high up in the mountains, accessible only by a narrow, rocky trail. The weather had been unpredictable, and as we made our way through the dense fog, I began to feel a sense of foreboding. The air grew colder, and the sky darkened with the promise of a storm. "We should be careful," warned Andres, one of the local guides. He had been leading our group through these mountains for years and had an instinct for weather patterns. "This storm might get worse." I nodded, my gut tightening. The road ahead seemed treacherous, but there was no turning back. We had come this far, and the villagers were counting on us to document their lives. We couldn't afford to delay. The rain started falling in sheets, and the path became slippery, treacherous even. I gripped the straps of my backpack tighter, trying to keep my footing as we navigated the narrow pass. The sound of the rain hitting the ground was deafening, and the cold seeped into my bones. Halfway through the journey, one of the group members, a young woman named Carla, slipped on the wet rocks and twisted her ankle. She cried out in pain, and immediately, a few of us rushed to her side. It was clear we couldn't continue in these conditions, and the guide suggested we take shelter in a nearby cave until the weather calmed down. The cave was dark, its entrance small and damp, but it provided shelter from the storm. We set up camp inside, huddling together for warmth. The situation was grim, our planned schedule was disrupted, and no one knew when the storm would end. Carla's ankle was swelling, and the uncertainty of our situation was starting to weigh heavily on us all. I sat by the fire, listening to the howling wind outside, my mind racing. We were stranded in a cave in the middle of the Andes Mountains, with limited supplies, a group member injured, and a storm that could last for days. Everything I had taken for granted. The comfort of home, the predictable rhythm of my life, felt distant and insignificant now. But as I sat there, something inside me shifted. I realized that this situation, though frightening and uncomfortable, was just another test. A test of strength, not just physical, but emotional and mental. Could I handle this? Could I continue to move forward when everything seemed uncertain? The answer, surprisingly, came in the form of the villagers who had accompanied us on our journey. Though they were just as caught in the storm as we were, they didn't seem as panicked. They had grown up in the mountains, and the harsh conditions were something they were accustomed to. They knew how to survive in the face of adversity. One of the older villagers, a woman named Carmen, sat down beside me as I stared into the fire. She handed me a small cup of tea, the warmth of it a welcome relief against the cold. "The mountains teach you patience," she said in her soft, weathered voice. "The storm will pass, but you must have the strength to wait it out." Her words resonated deeply with me. Patience. It was something I had struggled with in my life, always rushing, always seeking the next thing. But here, in the mountains, the storm wasn't something I could control. The only choice I had was to wait, to be present, and to trust that it would pass. For the next 2 days, we remained in the cave. We helped Carla as much as we could, keeping her ankle elevated and trying to make her as comfortable as possible. I spent hours talking to Carmen and the others, learning about their lives, their resilience, and how they had learned to survive in a world where nature was both a source of beauty and danger. As the storm finally subsided, the world outside seemed to change. The air was clearer, the sky a pale blue, and the mountains looked almost majestic in the early morning light. We packed up and resumed our journey, the trail now even more treacherous than before. But we were no longer afraid. We had learned that we were capable of more than we realized. By the time we reached the village, I had gained something invaluable, not just the photos I had taken, but a renewed sense of strength and perspective. The people of the village welcomed us with open arms, grateful for our presence, and I couldn't help but feel humbled by their generosity. They had faced hardships that many of us couldn't even imagine, and yet they lived with a sense of peace that I couldn't comprehend. That night, as I sat by the fire with the villagers, listening to their stories, I felt a deep connection to them. I realized that their strength came not from avoiding hardship, but from facing it head-on and allowing it to shape them into something greater. I had spent so long in my own world, focused on my own pain and fears, but now I understood. Life wasn't about avoiding storms, it was about finding the strength to weather them. As the fire crackled and the night grew cold, I made a promise to myself. I would no longer let fear dictate my life. I would embrace the unknown, even when it was uncomfortable, because I knew that on the other side of it lay growth, understanding, and the chance to become the person I was meant to be. When we finally returned to the city after weeks of traveling through the Andes, the bustling streets felt foreign. The noise, the bright lights, the constant motion, it all seemed so overwhelming after the stillness and simplicity of the mountains. My heart pounded as I stepped off the bus and into the familiar chaos of Lima. The world here was different. But in a strange way, it didn't hold the same power over me anymore. The old Emma, the one who had once craved comfort, stability, and a sense of control, felt like a distant memory. I had changed, not just on the outside, but on the inside, too. I checked into a small hotel, and for the first time in a long while, I felt exhausted, but not in the way I had before. It wasn't the exhaustion of running from something. It was the exhaustion of growth, of truly challenging myself, and of learning lessons I had never expected. I had stepped outside of my comfort zone in ways I hadn't thought possible, and in doing so, I had found a sense of peace I didn't even know I was searching for. That evening, I found myself sitting by the window, looking out over the city. The streets below were filled with cars, people, and noise, but up here, in my quiet room, I was alone with my thoughts. It was a strange feeling, no longer tethered to the past, but still uncertain about the future. I thought about Jake. I thought about my mom. I thought about the woman I had been when I left home and the woman I had become in the mountains. A quiet sense of clarity washed over me. It was time to stop looking backward. The past had shaped me, but it no longer had to define me. I thought about the lessons I had learned from the villagers, about resilience, about finding beauty in the struggle, and about embracing life even when it felt hard. But more than anything, I thought about the courage it took to start over, to rewrite the narrative of my life. I took out my phone and scrolled through the photos I had taken over the past several weeks. Each image told a story. Each frame captured a moment that would stay with me forever. But more than the photos, I realized that the stories were no longer just the stories of others. They were my story, too. The next morning, I woke up early, filled with a sense of purpose. I had an idea. Something I could do that would bring the lessons I had learned into the world in a meaningful way. I wasn't sure exactly how it would unfold, but I knew it was time to take the next step. No more hiding from what was to come. I reached out to the nonprofit I had been working with to propose an idea. I wanted to create a documentary that shared not just the stories of the people in these villages, but also my own journey, how I had come to understand the power of resilience, the importance of community, and the strength that comes from embracing both the light and dark sides of life. It wasn't just about telling their stories, it was about sharing a piece of mine, too. Over the next few weeks, I worked with the team to craft the documentary, combining footage from the villages with reflections from my time there. I spoke openly about my own struggles, my heartbreak, and my healing. It felt raw, vulnerable, but it also felt right. For the first time in years, I wasn't hiding behind a mask. I wasn't pretending to have everything figured out. I was showing the world who I had become, not just the woman who had left everything behind, but the woman who had found something deeper, something real. The project, when it was finished, was more than I had ever expected. It was a testament to the journey I had gone on, to the people who had opened my eyes to new possibilities, and to the strength that I had found within myself. But the most incredible part of all? The responses. People from all over the world reached out to me, strangers who had watched the documentary and found something in it that resonated with their own lives. They shared their stories of struggle and triumph, of loss and recovery. The words of encouragement and solidarity flooded in, and I realized that this was what I had been searching for all along: connection. I wasn't alone in this journey, and I had never been alone. In the darkest moments, I had always been surrounded by people, whether they were family, friends, or strangers, and together, we had all been able to rise above the pain and the fear. It was then that I knew, for certain, that I was ready to move forward, without any more doubts or regrets. The past was a part of me, but it didn't hold the power to control me anymore. I had learned to embrace who I was, who I had become, and who I was still becoming. I smiled at the thought of what lay ahead, feeling the weight of my journey lift off my shoulders. The future wasn't something to be feared, it was something to be lived. And I was finally ready to live it, fully and without apology. As I prepared to head back home, I felt lighter than I had in years. The woman who had once canceled her wedding because of heartbreak, the woman who had fled from the memories of her past, was no longer the same. She had transformed into someone stronger, more at peace, and ready to take on whatever came next. With one last look at the city below, I whispered to myself, I'm ready. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?